Ed Broadbent was not a texter. When he wanted to talk to me, he called me. Many of these calls were to check up on my family. He was a mentor, but he was a considerate friend who showed deep warmth. By and large, his calls, however, were to talk about what mattered immensely to him: political ideas. And I'll never forget my first cold call from Ed. I was in the food court of Toronto's Eaton Centre, and seeing his name on my screen, I quickly ducked into Sport Check, and I was immediately put on speakerphone. Ed and his then partner, the great socialist theorist Ellen Makesons Wood, launched immediately into debate. "Jonathan, we have some notes on the piece on The Guardian you forwarded." For the next 45 minutes, wedged between tennis rackets and hockey sticks, I was engulfed in discussion about the Greek debt crisis. True to Ed, I remember his despair at the blunt force of austerity, about the inequitable costs that would be borne by working people. And I'm going to miss those calls. We just heard about Ed's inspiring work at Rights and Democracy. Less well known was his work as vice president of the Socialist International. There, Ed was engaged in important diplomatic efforts in Central America, advancing human rights, often in concert with social movements, against an imposing current of repressive US foreign policy. Ed wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail in 1986, and it's quite remarkable. This was at a time when many leaders of social democratic parties were retreating from their convictions. Not Ed. He wrote, and I quote, "The world of a politician is a world of light and shadow. Never merely pragmatic, it is always moral. When we talk about democracy, pluralism, religious freedom, tolerance, human rights, and self-determination, we are not giving voice to mere abstractions relevant only to a few nations. We are talking about human values and ideals that we believe desirable for all people, at all times, in all parts of our world." Thank you.
It was on September the 28th, 1968, that Ed Broadbent rose to speak in the House of Commons for the very first time. By his own account, it was a pretty grand affair. I must say, Mr. Speaker, I am particularly pleased to see such a crowded House at 5:15 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, Ed remarked to the maybe 5 or so colleagues in attendance. Who would have thought that so many thousands would have turned out? A son of Oshawa, a city whose storied struggles against the greed of the automotive industry were a turning point for industrial unionism in North America, Ed had been elected to represent his hometown by a margin of just 15 votes after a stint as a professor of political theory at York University. And the speech he gave that day, at least to the 5 or so who may have heard it, was in every way completely and utterly him. For one thing, it began with a joke, delivered in his trademark deadpan. More seriously, it somehow swung with seemingly no effort from references to John Stuart Mill and Athenian democracy to celebrations of the gains won by ordinary people throughout the first part of the long 20th century. Pensions, the universal franchise, public health insurance, the revolutionary innovations of the welfare state. And in the speech, Ed made clear that while he regarded all of these things as important and tangible victories on the road to equality, they were also insufficient in realizing the task of real democracy and human freedom as he saw them. He wanted workers to have a greater say not just at the bargaining table, but in the running of their enterprises. He argued that the kind of austere democracy that leaves entrenched the hierarchies of our society is not fully a democracy. And he concluded by calling for a seismic shift of power from the few at the top to the many below. As Jonathan has just so eloquently reminded us, Ed Broadbent was a democratic socialist in the truest and deepest sense. He was a populist intellectual for whom the world of the mind, represented in the likes of history, philosophy, and economics, was inexorably linked to a greater modern struggle for equality and for our collective freedom. It was to that struggle, above all else, to which he ultimately devoted his life. Thank you.